Hello and welcome to Indus News live from Islamabad. I'm Jawad Tehami and these are the headlines. Pakistan's President Arif Alvi says India's year-long siege of occupied Kashmir is a proof that the Kashmiris rejected New Delhi's illegal annexation of the valley. Addressing a rally in Islamabad on Yom-e-Istihsal, the occupied Kashmir Siege Day, Alvi said New Delhi is changing the demography of the valley to rig a possible plebiscite. In his message on the day, Prime Minister Imran Khan said the Indian government is unabashedly pushing the Hindutva agenda on Kashmir. Khan said he will continue to be an ambassador for Kashmiris whose voices India has tried to silence. In Lebanon, the death toll from the explosion in central Beirut has risen to 100, with over 4,000 injured. The cause of the explosion remains unclear, but officials have linked the blast to ammonium nitrate being stored in the warehouse at the port. The global number of COVID-19 deaths has crossed 700,000, with infections exceeding 18.5 million. Latin America has reported the highest death toll, with more than 206,000 losing their lives to the disease. Brazil, the second worst hit country, has recorded over 1,100 deaths in the last 24 hours, increasing the tally to nearly 96,000. Meanwhile, in Pakistan, 15 people have died, while 675 have tested positive overnight, increasing the tally to over 281,000 cases. Sri Lankans are heading to polls today to elect a new parliament. Pre-polls surveys suggest President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's party is widely expected to win. Rajapaksa is seeking a two-thirds majority in the 225-member legislature to implement his economic and national security agenda. And in cricket, England hosts Pakistan today in the first of the three-match test series at Old Trafford, Manchester's biosecure bubble. 6 months since their last test match, Pakistan will face an in-form England side still fresh from beating West Indies 2-1 last month. Pakistan have drawn their past two series in England. Those were the headlines and detailed stories. Right after a short break, stay tuned. Welcome back, and now for the news in detail. Pakistan's President Arif Alvi says India's year-long siege of occupied Kashmir is a proof that the Kashmiris rejected New Delhi's illegal annexation of the valley. Addressing a rally in Islamabad on Yom-e-Istihsal, the occupied Kashmir Siege Day, Alvi said New Delhi is changing the demography of the valley to rig a possible plebiscite. He said Indian government's lockdown gagged freedom of expression, shuttered all businesses, causing $4 billion loss to Kashmiris. The president said India refuses international mediation on occupied Kashmir, saying it wants to resolve the issue bilaterally with Pakistan. But he said New Delhi has never honored a single bilateral pact, including the Simla Accord. The president said Pakistan will continue supporting Kashmiris' struggle for the right to self-determination on all forums. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Imran Khan says Indian government is unabashedly pushing the Hindutva agenda on Kashmir. In his message on the day, Khan said he will continue to be an ambassador of Kashmiris whose voices India has tried to silence. The rallies are being held across Pakistan, and a 1-minute silence has been observed across the country in solidarity with Kashmiris. Pakistan has urged the UN Security Council to meet over India's military siege in occupied Kashmir. In a letter to the UN Security Council President, Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi highlighted human rights violations in the area and subsequent attempts by India to change its demography. He said India's ceasefire violations along the LOC and belligerence towards Pakistan pose a threat to regional peace and security. Qureshi in his letter also pointed out India's abduction of Kashmiri youth, the ongoing systematic torture and extrajudicial killings. He said these atrocities epitomize New Delhi's brutality in suppressing the resistance movement against Indian occupation for over second decades.
India must lift sanctions. India must provide basic fundamental rights to the people of occupied Jammu and Kashmir. We will stand by you. We know, I am convinced that this tyranny and abuse of human rights will not break your resolve. It hasn't broken your resolve in the last so many decades. The last 7 decades, you have stood up for your right, and inshallah, you will continue to stand up for your rights and you will succeed.
Well, Pakistanis and Kashmiris living around the world are observing the 5th of August as Kashmir Siege Day. The day marks 1 year since India illegally stripped the region of its autonomy in violation of UN resolutions. A curfew has been imposed in several parts of the region in the wake of protests planned by anti-India groups to mark the 5th of August as Black Day. Our correspondent Isa Naqvi from Islamabad has more in this report.
5th of August marks a year of unabated terror, unleashed on the residents of what many call heaven on earth. This day reminds the world how it kept silent on the incarceration of 8 million people, young and old, men and women, the sick and even the children.
5th August 2019 will always remain as a very dark day in the long-standing saga of the freedom struggle of the people of Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. The illegal unilateral actions by India seeks to change the ground situation and unleash a brutalization, an organized, deliberate, choreographed brutalization of the people of Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir.
During the past 1 year, Indian security forces have been brutalizing Kashmiris with full impunity to persecute innocent civilians, demanding their just right to self-determination.
Powers given to security forces were always draconian, but the new ones that have been given now, and under which extrajudicial killings have become the norm, as I said earlier, have taken this brutalization of the innocent people of Kashmir to an unprecedented level. And the worst part is that there is complete impunity with which they operate, and they have, so to speak, blessings of the government of India.
Despite crushing curfew, communication blackout, mass incarcerations and extrajudicial murders, India has been unable to suppress the Kashmiris' call for freedom. Experts say the frustration of Indian government has found a new vent.
Whenever there are frustrations within India, then they sometimes boil over along the line of control or on the border with Pakistan. What we have seen in the last few months is extreme frustration by the Indian troops, by the Indian government.
India has indulged in deliberate, unprovoked ceasefire violations at the line of control to divert the attention of international community and hide its crimes in the occupied Kashmir. This year alone, India has committed over 1,800 ceasefire violations. Since its illegal actions in violation of UN resolutions, India has martyred 214 innocent Kashmiris and wounded around 1,400. But the chants for freedom from Indian oppression echo louder in the occupied Kashmir today. Reporting for Indus News, Isa Naqvi, Islamabad.
The international community has been criticizing India since it illegally revoked the special status of occupied Kashmir on the 5th of August last year. Lawmakers in the US, the UK, and other regional and international bodies are criticizing India, urging it to respect Kashmiris' rights. More in this report.
The Organization of Islamic Cooperation was the first to react with concern and reiterated its solidarity with the people of occupied Kashmir. The organization called for the immediate lifting of the curfew, restoration of communication, and respect for fundamental rights of Kashmiris. The UN Secretary General said the Kashmir issue needed to be resolved bilaterally and by peaceful means. Also, the United Nations Security Council held a closed-door meeting for the first time ever after India's controversial move. European Union lawmakers also criticized India for changing the constitutional status of the region in violation of UN resolutions. In the UK, a group of British MPs from the opposition Labour Party issued a letter to the Prime Minister demanding that London strongly condemn India's actions. In February this year, India denied visas to British MP Debbie Abrahams after she landed at the New Delhi International Airport. But in stark contrast to New Delhi's arrogance, Abrahams was welcomed by Pakistan and carried out a joint press conference with Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi, praising Islamabad's progressive stance on the Kashmir conflict. Over in the US, a congressional panel said Indian-occupied Kashmir is facing a humanitarian crisis and called New Delhi's annexation a disaster for Kashmiris. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has always been a vocal supporter of Pakistan's stance on Kashmir, and during his address to the Pakistan's National Assembly in Islamabad, he slammed India for its unilateral steps and pledged to support Pakistan. Dissident voices are also being heard from within India, asking Prime Minister Narendra Modi-led government to restore the special status of occupied Kashmir. Human rights activists in India say Modi has tarnished India's secular image by illegally annexing the occupied territory.
International media outlets and newspapers bashed India over the unilateral revocation of occupied Kashmir's special status. On this day last year, Delhi scrapped Article 370 of its constitution and declared the valley a union territory.
India flooded 80,000 troops into the valley, detained thousands, and imposed harsh movement restrictions and communications blackout. Global media slammed New Delhi for its oppressive actions in the territory and called it out on its atrocities. British newspaper The Guardian wrote, "This sudden move will have consequences for India that are difficult to predict." American newspaper New York Times said India silenced the voice of Kashmir before passing the controversial bill. The Independent wrote, "Through this decree, the Modi government has shut the door for a democratic, peaceful solution in Kashmir." Calling out the move, Al Jazeera headlined India's suspension of Article 370 as the darkest day for democracy in the country. Turkish broadcaster, the TRT World, called out New Delhi on its attempts to change the demography of the occupied valley and said it has plunged the territory to new lows.
In Lebanon, the death toll from the explosion in central Beirut has risen to 78, with over 4,000 injured. The blast sent shockwaves across the city, causing widespread damage even on the outskirts of the capital. President Michel Aoun says over 2,700 tons of ammonium nitrate used in fertilizers and bombs was being stored at the port for 6 years without safety measures. He called for a probe into the cause of the blast, with the result to be released within 5 days. Aoun called for an urgent cabinet meeting and said a 2-week state of emergency should be declared in the country. Prime Minister Hassan Diab said Beirut is mourning and all of Lebanon is facing a catastrophe.
What happened today won't pass without accountability. Those responsible will pay the price for what happened. This is a promise for the martyrs and the wounded. This is a national commitment. Facts will be revealed about this dangerous warehouse that has been there since 2014.
US President Donald Trump called the huge explosion in Beirut a terrible attack, but he did not present any evidence to back his claim. Now, moving on, the global number of COVID-19 deaths has crossed 700,000, with infections exceeding 18.5 million. Latin America has reported the highest death toll, with more than 206,000 losing their lives to the virus. Brazil has recorded over 1,100 deaths in the last 24 hours, taking the tally to nearly 96,000.
The Americas continue to be the hardest hit region in the world by the coronavirus pandemic. Brazil has the second highest number of infections and death tolls in the world. Mexico is not too far behind, reporting the second highest number of cases and deaths in Latin America. In the US, President Donald Trump insists that lockdowns are not needed even as the country's cases near 4.8 million. But the news of progress from Novavax vaccine trials has given hope.
We give them two shots. After the second shot, we take some blood. We mix that blood that has the antibodies in it that could be protective, and we mix that with virus, and we see if the virus will grow. And you actually dilute that out, and that can actually give you a measurement of how much antibody you have. And so the striking thing about our vaccine is that it gives you a lot of antibody. It should be very protective.
In Europe, the virus is on the rebound as Germany reported more than 700 cases overnight. France reported a rise in intensive care patients for the first time since April. In Australia, the second most populous state of Victoria has reported a surge in cases and deaths and imposed a strict lockdown.
If we all continue to do as we should, making better choices, then we'll keep our community safe and we will get to the other side of this. The alternative, of course, is these restrictions lasting for much longer than they should.
Meanwhile, in Asia, mainland China has reported a further decline in daily cases, with under 30 cases reported overnight. In South Korea, authorities are fighting to get the virus under control as both local and imported cases rise.
The COVID-19 is on a steady decline in Pakistan with over 254,000 recoveries. The Health Ministry says there are now nearly 21,000 active infections in the country. The ministry said the death count has risen by 15 to 6,014. It says 675 tested positive in the last 24 hours, increasing the tally to over 281,000. The ministry said 872 patients are in critical condition. Sindh remains the worst hit province with over 122,000 infections, while Punjab has over 93,000. It's time for a short break. We'll be back with more stories. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Sri Lankans are heading to polls today to elect a new parliament. Pre-polls survey show President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's party is widely expected to win. Rajapaksa is seeking a two-thirds majority in the 225-member legislature to implement his economic and national security agenda. The tourism-dependent island is struggling since deadly militant attacks last year, followed by economic setback of the pandemic. Country's election commission has put strict social distancing rules in place to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. Votes will be counted on Thursday. In Libya, Tobu tribes have filed a lawsuit at the International Criminal Court against Khalifa Haftar over last year's massacre in Marzouk city. In a statement, tribal leaders said the lawsuit seeks to punish those who bombed residential areas in the city. They said the massacre was intentional and alleged that warplanes belonging to the UAE were involved in the raids. On August the 4th last year, 40 people were killed and dozens wounded in an airstrike in Marzouk. Meanwhile, the US says it is deeply troubled by escalating tensions in Libya, warning that any intensification will only prolong the conflict. National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien said efforts to escalate the conflict are a risk to collective security interests. China says it does not want tensions with the US to escalate any further. China's ambassador to the US, Cui Tiankai, said the world's top two economies should cooperate instead of confronting each other. Speaking at the virtual Aspen Security Forum, Cui urged both nations to learn from history, saying a new Cold War will not benefit anyone. He said Washington and Beijing were continuing collaboration and making progress on the Phase 1 trade deal. Cui said Beijing was ready to solve the dispute over the South China Sea through negotiations with other countries. This follows a surge in bilateral tensions over tit-for-tat consulate closures, media row, and the Chinese app TikTok. Beijing says Washington must immediately stop the political suppression of the US-based Chinese media and journalists. In a news briefing, the Foreign Ministry spokesperson said the US prides itself on press freedom but obstructs Chinese reporters from doing their job in the country. Wang Wenbin said Chinese media and journalists have strictly followed professional ethics of journalism and upheld the principles of objectivity. He said if the US keeps making mistakes like these, China will be forced to take necessary and justified measures. In May, the US issued new guidelines restricting visas for journalists of Chinese origin to 90 days with the possibility of extension. But since then, no Chinese journalists in the US have had their applications for visa renewal approved amid worsening tensions. Myanmar's de facto leader Aung San Suu Kyi has filed a candidacy application for a parliamentary election to be held in November. Aung San Suu Kyi leads the ruling National League for Democracy, also known as NLD. She submitted an application at an election commission office in Yangon. The NLD aims to maintain its majority in the parliament by fielding candidates in almost all electoral districts. The party won a landslide victory in the previous election in 2015 after more than half a century of military rule. The election is scheduled for November the 8th, with political parties to start campaigning early next month. Well, climate change remains the most pressing issue of today's time, yet the world continues to falter when it comes to tackling the problem. Amid concerns about the environment, scientists have found that the carbon dioxide emissions are still on the rise. More in this report.
Earth's atmosphere is even more sensitive to carbon dioxide emissions than was earlier thought. A World Climate Research Program study has found that the doubling of carbon dioxide could lead global temperatures to rise by 2.6 to 4.1 degrees Celsius. This puts the lowest rise more than 1 degree above scientists' previously estimated range of 1.5 to 4.5 degrees Celsius. Co-author of the study, Zeki Hausfather, a climate scientist, says the study offers a better sense of exactly how much the Earth will warm up as carbon dioxide emission rises.
So the study is a big 4-year-long assessment of how sensitive the Earth's climate is to increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And what we mean by sensitive is essentially if we double the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, exactly how much will the Earth warm? And to put it in perspective, we're on track to double CO2 at our current rate of emissions by around 2080 or so.
The study relies on computer simulations using satellite observations, historic temperature records, and evidence of prehistoric temperatures from tree rings. Climate scientist Andrew Dressler says, if we do not rapidly ratchet down emissions, there is going to be a lot of suffering.
COVID-19 is not going to solve climate change. And in fact, the lesson of COVID-19 is that you cannot solve climate change by simply telling people to consume less. What you need to do to solve climate change is to switch our energy sources. And that is not going to happen on its own.
The severe effects of global warming are expected from a rise beyond 2 degrees Celsius. Already, the average global temperature has risen by about 1.2 degrees Celsius.
Arrived in Azad Kashmir to express solidarity with the Kashmiris, and let's watch live. And he's also expected to address the session of the Azad Jammu and Kashmir Legislative Assembly. These are the live visuals coming on your TV screen from Azad Kashmir, where Prime Minister Imran Khan has just arrived a short while ago, and he will be addressing the session of the Azad Jammu and Kashmir Legislative Assembly. The Prime Minister is there to express solidarity with the Kashmiris who have been subjugated, particularly after 5th of August last year, after India illegally and unilaterally revoked the Article 370 of its constitution to snatch the autonomy. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan has just arrived in Azad Kashmir to express solidarity with the Kashmiris on this particular day, as it is 5th of August, and the Pakistanis and Kashmiris around the world are observing this day as a Yom-e-Istisal, which is Kashmir Siege Day. And Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan is there, and he has just unveiled the plaque over there, and in a short while he will be addressing the session of the Azad Jammu and Kashmir Legislative Assembly. And President of Azad Jammu and Kashmir, Sardar Masood Khan, is also accompanying the Prime Minister, and certain cabinet members are also accompanying the Prime Minister during his visit to Azad Kashmir. And a short while ago, he has just arrived over there. In a short while, he is expected to address the session of Azad Jammu and Kashmir Legislative Assembly. And earlier in his statement on Kashmir Siege Day, Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan said that India is trying to impose its Hindutva agenda on Kashmir, which is a threat to regional stability and security. And he also said he will continue to be the ambassador for the struggle of the Kashmiris for their freedom and the right to self-determination. At the moment, you can see these live visuals coming on your TV screens from Azad Kashmir, where Prime Minister Imran Khan has just arrived a short while ago. President of Azad Jammu and Kashmir and Prime Minister of Azad Jammu and Kashmir both are accompanying the Prime Minister at the moment. In a short while, he is expected to address the session of the Azad Jammu and Kashmir Legislative Assembly. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan, in his statement on Kashmir Siege Day, which is a Yom-e-Istisal, which is being observed by Pakistanis and Kashmiris around the globe against India's illegal and unilateral action of annexing the occupied and disputed territory, Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan said he will continue to be the ambassador of the struggle the Kashmiris are having for their right to self-determination and against India's atrocities and the brutalities which have increased manifold, particularly since it revoked the Article 370 of its constitution and snatching the autonomy of the Indian occupied territory, which is against the UN resolutions on Kashmir. And not only the UN resolutions on Kashmir, but also against the partition plan. It is also against the bilateral pacts, particularly the Simla Accord between Pakistan and India, which clearly stipulates that Indian occupied Kashmir is a disputed territory. And this dispute would be resolved as per the aspirations of the Kashmiris and as per the UN plebiscite. But this particular promise has never been fulfilled, which is a fact that has been alluded by the President of Pakistan as well in his earlier address to the rally today, when he said that the Indian forefathers had promised Kashmiris that they would be giving their right to self-determination to Kashmiris, but it's been decades that it has never been fulfilled. And especially last year on this day, 5th of August, India unilaterally and illegally went in contravention of all the UN resolutions and all the pacts with Pakistan as well, and against all the international conventions by snatching the autonomy of Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir and making it a union territory. And since then, this occupied valley, which has been called as heaven on earth by many, has been under consistent siege, a crushing curfew and communication blackout for the past one exact year. And during this particular time, when the world was grappling with the COVID-19 pandemic, the atrocities and the brutalities of the Indian occupation forces increased manifold, and the people were not only being denied the basic rights to education, freedom of expression was gagged as well, and the people were not even given the basic amenities of life, including the necessary healthcare to fight with the COVID-19 pandemic. Prime Minister Imran Khan has arrived in Azad Kashmir, and he is expected to address the session of the Azad Jammu and Kashmir Legislative Assembly as well. The President and Prime Minister of Azad Kashmir are also accompanying the Prime Minister as well. In his earlier statement, Prime Minister Imran Khan said he would continue to be the ambassador of the struggle the Kashmiris are having to have the right to self-determination and the freedom from Indian subjugation. And it's been over 7 decades the Kashmiris are facing the Indian atrocities, but their spirit to get the right to self-determination has not diminished over these decades, and particularly after the revocation of Article 370 last year by India. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan has arrived in Azad Jammu and Kashmir, and he will be addressing the Azad Jammu and Kashmir Legislative Assembly session in a short while. And earlier, as you saw on your TV screens, he unveiled the plaque of a resistance wall that has been enacted over there in Azad Kashmir beside the Parliament building. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan has arrived in Azad Kashmir, and as he speaks to the Assembly session of Azad Jammu and Kashmir Legislative Assembly, we'll take you live there. For now, we'll take a look at the business stories from around the world. Stocks in Asia Pacific are trading mixed as uncertainty over the state of US coronavirus relief measure lingers. Mainland Chinese stocks are trading higher, while Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index has gained over 0.5%. Elsewhere, South Korea's Kospi has jumped over 1%. In Japan, the Nikkei 225 and Topix Index dipped below the flat line, following 2 solid days of gains. Meanwhile, in Australia, the ASX 200 fell close to 0.5%. Overall, MSCI Asia ex Japan Index gained over 0.5%. In cricket, England host Pakistan today in the first of the 3-match test series at Old Trafford, Manchester's biosecure bubble. 6 months since their last test match, Pakistan will face an in-form England side still fresh from beating West Indies 2-1 last month. Azhar Ali is leading a 16-man squad that also includes former captain Sarfraz Ahmed. The visitors have drawn their past 2 series in England. And that is all for now. For the further updates, you can follow us on social media at Indus Talks.